So for everyone's information, we are recording the session for others from the LGE Plus community to be able to watch back at a later date. Leading Greater Essex Plus, as hopefully you all know, is the alumni space for those of us who've taken part in the Leading Greater Essex programmes that have been running in various guises actually since 2016. The current cohort will be passing out, so to speak, in the celebrating their 2024 celebration event in November. And I am now stepping back into the Leading Greater Essex daily sort of running programme space, as well as being involved with the alumni LGE Plus space. So you will see me promoting the fact that we're going to be finding places for people taking part in LGE 2025, which will begin in the new year. So if you've got colleagues, friends, partners who might be interested, do watch this space, because we'll be using you, the alumni, as part of our advertising and campaigning process. So today, for Unplugged, we are blessed with the presence of our historical quizmaster, Councillor Cllr Spence, who is here to tell us a bit about himself, his story, his journey, and his perception of all things that may be of interest to those of us who are working in the complexity of the public service systems in Greater Essex in which we find ourselves working. So welcome, John. Over to you. Speak for as long as you wish. We have in total up until 2 p.m. and the rest of the room would love to ask you questions, I'm sure, afterwards. Please give us guidance as to your preference as to whether those questions come into the chat and are read to you either as you go along or later on, or whether you would just like hands raised at the end and we manage those hands, acknowledging that both myself and John are visually impaired and that I am using tech to hear who's raising hands and things, but John is not using that tech as such. Over to you, John.
Now, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for making time in your hugely busy days to spend some time with me. Easiest for me, Kate, if I just give them a talk, and Will, I'll ask you to shut me up at 25 minutes so that there's at least as much time for you to ask me questions or make comments as I've waffled on for. I've done two bits of it, one about the life journey, but secondly, having had the privilege of working in so many different places, things I have learned, and which, prior to being a councillor, I was asked to go around some of the boardrooms of this country to share my thinking, which I'll explain. Cllr Spence, born in Edinburgh, grew up in a house, a small house inside of Edinburgh, local primary school, sent by the headmaster's recommendation to secondary and a direct route school, truly the best vehicle to social mobility prior to their abolition. University in Trinity College, Dublin. My parents had to move because of my father's work, and I knew them to be in ill health. So I went there. Not the best decision for me, but it was the best decision for them as they started dying 2 years later. And then it did give me the richness, by the way, of being in Dublin. My 21st birthday was Bloody Sunday, and I took part in the decision to close the university as I was the senior student representative. You may think this odd in an Irish university, a British Tory as the senior student rep. After many opportunities, joined Lloyds Bank on their graduate programme in Merseyside, because I proposed to Yvonne, my wife, of now 49 years and 10 months and 29 days standing.
Wow, congratulations.
When I was 17, and she was in Edinburgh, my parents Dublin. So started Merseyside, up to Newcastle, down to London, and various management jobs, and Harvard Business School, sent by the bank in 1984, 40 years ago. And you know, I can still remember so many of the learnings from that course. It was fabulous. Back into this country, and on we go. I'd never had good eyesight. I used to go to Scout Camp. I can always remember loving it during the day, but seeing the sun setting and think, now the trouble begins. I didn't know I was night blind. I didn't know, indeed, I had retinitis pigmentosa until I was in my late 20s. So pretty horrible at nights, and because it was horrible at nights, I fell into ditches and so on, and got homesick, and the scout leaders just thought I was falling into ditches deliberately because I was homesick. So you see how the vicious circle. I did have the very great distinction of when other boys went out to have a pee during the night, I was the only man who managed to pee into the adjoining patrol's tent. Not one of my finest moments. And when I came back from Harvard Business School, my eyes had been stable for many years, but I noticed that I needed extra lighting in my office. And within 3-4 years, I was registered partially blind, told I would become blind in my 50s with tunnel vision. In fact, by 1990, I was registered fully blind, unable to see a page, let alone the print on it, and with peripheral vision. At that time, I went, I had the good fortune here. I was the youngest area director in the bank. I was in charge of West London. So that was good fortune, because at that time, the only other people in the bank who were blind were managing manual switchboard exchanges or working in things like the post room. I went to see the personnel director and said, look, I just thought I should check that my career is still on track. Or, you've sent me to Harvard, I'm clearly high regarded. And he said, well, we still think very highly of you, but we can't promote you, can we? I said, oh, really? I said, why not? And he said, because you can't manage people, can you? And I said, why not? He said, because looking people in the eye is a key part of the relationship between managed and manager, and you can't do that. So you can't lead people, despite the fact I already had 450 staff. And I just said to him, look, there's a very strange thing I can still hear. And most people have a mouth from which sound emanates. And I reckon if I can tell where their mouth is, then a couple of inches, or in your case now, centimeters above that, you will find their eye. And I went on to carry on the roles I did in the bank, and was very happy when managing director of the whole retail bank to enable him to take early retirement. But I share with you first, because the first thing you have to do in understanding blindness or any disability is you have to convince people who will assume things that you cannot do. And it becomes a trick as to how to sometimes take people by surprise. I was appointed as Managing Director of Business Banking in 1994, went on to be Chief Executive of Lloyds TSB Scotland, came back to run the entire branch networks of retail bank before being asked to come back in-house, if you like, and turn from being poacher to gamekeeper as Director of Risk and Policy. Loved the bank till the day I left. It was all right when I left it. I'm tempted to say in 2005, at the fourth attempt, I just wanted to do other things. And do you know that life has been so kind to me? It's just been absolutely so wonderful. Along the way, well, let me just share the roles I did after leaving the bank and before I became a councillor. Non-executive director of the newly formed Revenue and Customs, bringing together the Inland Revenue and the Customs and Excise. I worked as a non-executive director for the government on their Capital for Enterprise programme, bringing all the different enterprise initiatives together. I was appointed to be a non-executive director, well, perversely, of the Skipton Building Society, but that was only because of another company that I had followed since it was started, called Cllr Credit, of which I was to become the chairman. It went from nothing in 2004 to being sold for £1 billion in 2018. Sadly for me, because I took my regulated role in there very seriously and the need for independence, I refused to take any equity. That's a bit of a shame. I spent 10 years as chairman of Spicer Hart Group, the estate agents nationally, but based in Essex. I currently am chairman of the Cambridge Building Society. I am still on the board of the Business Banking Resolution Service, which I was asked to serve on by government as part of the resolution of very long-held grievances against the banking sector. On the religious side, because I've always had a deep faith, I've had numerous roles across Chelmsford Cathedral, the Diocese of Chelmsford, and St Paul's Cathedral, and then nationally as from 2004 to 13, one of the Queen's Crown Commissioners in charge of the assets of the church, and from 13 to 23, Finance Chairman of the Church of England through the Archbishop's Council. And the other thing that happened by being blind was it took me into the wonderfully rich world of disability. Absolutely fabulous. And over a succession of years, I was chairman of Blind in Business, Action for Blind People, a trustee of the RNIB because I took the two into merger, Revitalised, and then known as Vitalised, providing respite care. I was president of Enable, which is Scotland's MenCap. And all the time I saw and worked with people who had spent their lives being told what they cannot do, and who were too often wrapped in cotton wool or incarcerated, but who merely understood that the way we run the race of life is to jump over an additional hurdle. At Blind in Business, back in the early 2000s, we used to take 20 blind undergraduates every year to a training college in West London, where we would spend, they would be there for 2 days, and on the first morning we'd give them exercises and learnings about how to cope with psychometric testing, group exercises, and all the other devices you see used in the milk round from university. And on the second day, 20 employers who had paid for the whole thing came in to give them one-to-one coaching. And that often led to job interviews, job offers. And we have alumni of Blind in Business across most of the major accountancy, consulting, telephonic and other firms based in the City of London and across the country. On that first afternoon, we take those 20 undergraduates to a lake in southwest London, where we would introduce them to boat drivers they had never met. And we would take them out on the boat and we would let them be taught how to water ski. And in the evening when they came back, I would do my talk with them. And this was the point of liberation, helping us understand we can all do anything virtually if we have the will to do it. We can all build our own futures. We can create the future if we can strip away the things that get in the way, the strappings, and have total focus. That I would record in place after place. As president of Enable, I met a chap who at the age of 15 was incarcerated in a mental asylum. You remember going back now, quite a long time, and who was eventually released at the age of 59 under the Care in the Community initiative. I met him when he was 61. He'd got his first job working in a supermarket in Paisley. He was in charge of the car park. All he had was Down syndrome. That was all it was. But if you understand people with Downs, A, they tend to be very warmly welcoming, and B, can often be fastidiously tidy. He ran that car park like clockwork. Nobody dared to leave a trolley out of place or to drop litter because they soon knew about it. Yet whose supermarket trolley was full of gifts at Christmas? Because they always appreciated the warmth of his welcome. Well, 20 years on, I'm delighted to say, well, 15 years on, I'm delighted to see now that we have people with learning disabilities not being employed in car parks alone, but actually inside supermarkets, often manning tills, even if it is the 10 items or less on the cash only tills. We make progress all the time in helping people understand that those with disability are merely those who run the race of life while jumping another hurdle. My life's been richly blessed in other ways. I've worked with various members of the royal family, and I was the treasurer for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Trust. What a privilege it is to work with people from so many different backgrounds and to actually end up sharing jokes with your sovereign is fantastic. And what's what's so also wonderful is how the work was unlocked, and over the period of 5 years, we spent 105 million doing things that simply would not have happened otherwise across the continent, with a lasting legacy in that place. I would merely, mind you, say, never accept a lift from a bishop, because it was the Bishop of London who gave me a lift to a church commissioners meeting, asked if I had a CV, could I send it? I said, why? He said, well, I can't see too much. And 3 months later, a letter arrived signed by Sir John Major, the chairman, thanking me for agreeing to be the treasurer of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Trust. And if I point out to you that the other trustees were of the nature of the Queen's private secretary, the governor of the Bank of England, the Director General of the Commonwealth, plus Lord Robertson, Baroness Scotland, Baroness Hogg, you might understand who was there to do the work. But it was still a privilege to be able to work in so many different places. And of course, I joined the County Council in 2013, when the last leader, Peter Martin, who lives in the same division that I now represent, decided he was packing up and took me out for lunch. I could cope with that, but took me out to lunch a second time. And I came into the council and subsequently served in the cabinet, originally around finance, but for the last 7.5 years, adult social care, public health, NHS integration, and now children's services. And I think it may be because of the fact that I've worked across national government and local government, around large public companies, small companies, across the voluntary sector and the church, that in almost every aspect of every boardroom, it's 30 years since my, no, sorry, what was I saying, 39 years since my first board appointment. I think people just can see I've just got quite a lot of background thinking about. And one of the wonderful things is just to realize how much you've learned along the way, and you never stop learning. And I just thought in the remaining minutes, I would just share some highlights. I used to do an hour-long talk about, not an hour-long, 30-minute talk, but an hour-long session boardroom, lessons from the boardroom. I just thought I'd share 4 of them. Firstly, intuition's important, but always follow the evidence. So I took business banking in 4 years from 1994 in Lloyds, from a profit of 10 million, poorest rating and quality service and a 14% market share, to a 28% market share, top in service quality, and a £200 million profit. How did that happen? It happened because while I was sitting in the hotel room pending me getting a flat in Bristol, where I was based, I was looking at the numbers and I realized, and bear in mind that in the 1990s interest rates were very high, that people who run businesses like to keep quite a lot of money in current account. And as banks don't pay interest on current accounts, there is a significant margin in there. Therefore, if I went for growing market share in the back of service quality, I would immediately drive up profitability to enable reinvestment in other services. And that's all it was. The evidence was clear. I followed the evidence and the rest followed. And one of the great privileges I have in the County Council at the moment, because effectively I'm doing cradle to grave, is I can see the golden threads and how disjointed they often have been and seek to bring them together. Learning number 2, don't compromise on competence. So I was now managing director for the whole of the retail bank. It became pretty clear to me that while I had a very good operational team, I was lacking in strategic capacity. I needed somebody who could really build the future 5 years ahead. And I thought I could do it by rearranging the deck chairs. Totally wrong. It was the biggest mistake I think I made. Well, probably there's one other big mistake I made, but that was because I relied on other people. But in that case, I made the mistake, and in the end, it just didn't work out. I did not have even though I'd moved I'd moved into that place, the person I thought best person to do it, they still weren't good enough. And so one learned that piece. Thirdly, never believe your own publicity. I could give you 2 or 3 examples of this, but the one that will be best known to you is the Royal Bank of Scotland, who in the early 2000s progressed from being an ordinary regional bank to being the highest capitalized bank in the world, and having huge ambitions, getting involved in a massive fight to take over NatWest against the Bank of Scotland, seeking to take over the Bank of China, led by a chief executive with whom I worked closely in Scotland, Fred Goodman, who, when I was chief executive of Lloyds TSB Scotland, he was chief executive of the Clydesdale Bank, and was recruited by the then chairman of the Royal Bank of Scotland, then chief executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland, to be his deputy. I, incidentally, was approached to be the other deputy, but declined. Fred was a very good manager. I don't want anyone to say anything about his competence. But as he grew in market rating, he absolutely believed he was unbreakable. He was absolutely walking across the world, striding across the world, and nobody could knock him off that perch because he was just so good. And of course, what happened is that the bank overstretched itself, and all that went on with its collapse. And the tragedy of the collapse was not that Sir Fred lost his knighthood, or that he has had to make do with his 400,000 a year pension. The tragedy is that so many staff who had been invited to invest in the bank shares lost all their savings, because nobody was there telling them not to put all their savings into the bank. And they believed Fred, and they believed the board, that this thing was going on forever. Falling. The same happened to Lloyds, by the way, after I left. And my 4th management lesson for you from the boardroom: never believe you know everything. I was on the margins of a study at Harvard when I was there, which was published in the 90s, called Humility in Leadership. And it seeks to demonstrate the link between transformative change and humility, and argues that it is the leader who has the greatest humility, the greatest awareness of what they do, an inveterate appetite to suck in knowledge and learning from wherever it comes, that will be able to achieve the greatest change. When I ran Lloyds Bank Networks laterally, I had 26,000 people. And I always used to say, I will go out all the time. I would leave every Thursday without appointments on the basis I could go out and listen to the people. Not always getting there. I was often needed for board meetings and so on, but getting out maybe 1, 2 weeks, 2 Thursdays a month. Because I always believed that at least 10,000 of them would have a better answer than me. I continue to learn. Alison and Will, who have been with me this morning, have been pushing me hard on some issues, and I listen and I react. And I go home and ponder and I learn. And if you just keep as a learning sponge all the time, I'll say to you now, after 51 years since I started on paid employment, I learn and I enjoy and I have the thrill, the absolute thrill of knowing that what I do is making a difference. And that for me is the greatest motivator of all. Enough, I think really from me. I will hand back to Kate to let you, if any of you've stayed awake and not gone on, done better things, to ask any questions you may have.
Thank you, John. I'm sure we've all been as riveted as I have been, despite the major thunderstorm that crashed over my head during your talking. So I was alarmed that I might lose the internet connection, but because it had glitched this morning a bit. But no, I've stuck with you, and we've been recording every word upon which I've been hanging. certainly I know that if you ask me to go windsurfing or anything else behind a boat, I'm a terrible sailor and I've got awful shoulders and knees, so they wouldn't thank you for being dragged along in water. But nonetheless, everything else that you've suggested is very inspiring. So I open up to the rest of the room. Who has got questions for John? And Will Hooper, could I look to you to manage the hand raising and letting John know who's speaking, please?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. Oh, got people, somebody's left. Got a hand going up?
Yes, Greg Middleton.
Yeah, thank you, Will, and thank you, John. Really inspiring and fascinating to hear those examples and your reflections and lessons from the boardroom as you describe them. One question that I was really interested in is that you've moved around both geographically and thematically. So, you mentioned some roles that you had in, I think, estate agents and customs, as well as keeping a handle on the banking sector. And you touched at the end around your motivations, which perhaps answers the question. But I'm just interested in what prompted you to, what was the ambition around taking on different roles? Because you haven't, you were excelling in the banking industry and obviously doing really well. What prompted you to think, I want to try something else and turn your hand to something else when you were clearly doing very ably at one thing?
Greg, thanks. I'd love to hear you, Greg. This implies a plan. It was never a plan. I'm showing you. Things just happened along the way. I mean, the bank moved me about, and I always said that they kept moving me too early. I built up a team in West London, which went from being a group of no-hopers to being the highest performing team in the bank. When I left, they appointed another director to take charge, who sadly had a bit of a drink problem, wasn't a great manager anyway, and the thing fell apart. And people said to me afterwards, gosh, it must have been gratifying that you could build up that team and get so much out of them, but the person behind you couldn't. And I said, which builder would ever want to leave the site for the house to collapse? And it's just, so they did keep moving back. Everything else that happened basically because people pulled me in a direction. I mean, I'd always had the church interest and I've always had the political interest. So, and so those things were very much coming out of my things I liked doing. I've always had a great community interest. But it was never knowingly going into a estate agency. It happened because I had a friend called Kevin Bentley who had another friend who needed some help. And Kevin asked me to go and talk to him. And that's how that happened. In terms of Call Credit, the company that grew to $1 billion, I had signed their first contract when I was manager director at Lloyd's. And when I retired, they asked me to help them, and I ended up being a non-executive. So things just happened along the way. But I would just share with you, it doesn't always matter the scale. So I am satisfied in my mind there are things that have happened on adult social care in Essex County Council that would not have happened without my leadership. But if you tell me what gives me an equal thrill, it's when I can go to the lady on the main road in Danbury who has lived in a house which 5 yards away has a lamppost. And for years that lamppost shone at night with a sodium light. But then we changed to LED lighting and her bedroom was transformed into full daylight all night. And she tried and tried and tried to get change. And I was able to get our highways people to go along and just put a tiny bit of a lampshade on that light and restore her life to the quality it had been. That's great. The case I've got at the moment with somebody whose tree's too close to him, there's been a huge argument as to who's the land. And 2 weeks ago, he wrote me a note to say it's solved and it's coming down. I didn't want to see the tree down, neither did he. But it's when you can solve a problem, whether it's as small as that in our lives, it's big in theirs. And that's why it's such a privilege to represent the community in which you live. But don't give me the credit of a plan, Greg. There never was.
Thank you, John.
Never was.
And Sharon Harrington.
Hello, Sharon.
Hi, John. I'm a bit in awe at the size of your portfolio, I must admit. I think you described it as cradle to grave. I'm really interested to hear about your aspirations. I think you talked about the challenges of things being really disjointed. What kind of one or two things do you think would make a really big difference?
What, in terms of that particular piece of work?
Yeah. I think you were talking about the experience of families and their journey from cradle to grave and how it's quite disjointed in terms of services.
So what you can see, is the ability, and I have written a note, which I'm quite happy to share with you. I'm not particularly private about it, but you learn. So you learn that one of the big challenges we have, just to give you a joy of darkness, is getting children school ready. And that should be great, but we know that if children aren't school ready by the age of 5, they'll never achieve their outcomes. So then you realise that sitting in public health, there is a programme that recognises that if pregnant mums are obese, they're much more likely to give birth to a child with a disability or who has a chronic illness problem. So you're seeing that piece, and then you're looking at, so what you needed to do to get them school ready is physical activity, good eating, and that bit of interest. And then you do a longitudinal study of parents who are working so hard that they are time poor. They simply don't have, it is as much as they can do to get the food on the table on a daily basis, not ask them to plan 3-5 years ahead. And you think, how do those interventions work most carefully there? And then you look at the role of the schools in working with the children, avoiding the mental frailty that can so often follow conditions. I got bullied at school at one time, didn't last particularly long, I sorted it out, but I did. But once I got the bus home, that was the end of it. Today it follows you into the bedroom, doesn't it? And so all of those issues come on. You look now at what's happening with disability, and I think there's some really big questions about definitions. How can it be that one in 5 children aged 15 have a disability? I think one study says 1 in 3. It's just bizarre. But if you accept there are young people with disabilities, I always think about how you join up programs, and I call it from adolescence to independence. How we need to work with children at school, even at primary school, the later stages of primary school, to think ahead to potential careers, and then to work with them, particularly those with disabilities. And we have more and more children that do have real disabilities around autism, ADHD. How you work with them to prepare them to be ready for an independent life rather than prepare them for a life of dependence. How you create in them the skills and confidence that will enable them to grow. And within Essex County Council at the moment, there are 3 laudable initiatives, all sitting by side to side, that have not been talking to each other. Inclusive employment, meaningful lives matter, and towards adulthood, sitting across 3 different places. And we need them all to talk to each other and get joined up. It may not be Sharon, there should have meant to be 3 programs. But they all need to understand how they interplay and achieve the outcome that they want, optimizing people's lives in ways which enable financial sustainability for the council and the best life for the individual. So that's where you see, and I could give you further examples through life, Sharon, but you'll get the drift.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think it's a really complex thing to resolve, isn't it? And we can often get stuck into a project that fixes one problem, but not necessarily understand the wider determinants of the benefits and that kind of thing. So I think.
So if anybody wondered why you have integrated care boards and integrated care systems, you see fully the interdependency between the county council service, local authority services, and the NHS. And there is huge opportunity there. But of course, what we tend to do is all focus on the areas for which we are responsible. and seek to focus on making sure they do well. And that can often come across as silo working. And it's how you can try to get beyond that. And that is very difficult because, of course, it always takes two to tango.
Brilliant reflections, thank you.
We've got John Fox.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, John. That was, yeah, really inspirational. Something I was interested in about, because you talked about having a deep faith, and it strikes me that in a world where faith seems to be becoming more excluded and not something relevant, I just wondered how your faith has influenced your life and influenced and your work in life as well.
Well, thank you. I might challenge your premise. I could argue most of the wars in the world underway at the moment are around religion and faith, so which I find deeply depressing at that level. It's interesting, and it's deepened as I've gone through life, really, because I think I mean, apart from going blind, and I have a daughter who's living with a life-limiting brain tumor. I have another daughter who was widowed at the age of 40, and I don't know how you cope with everything if you don't feel that there is something there that's taking you. But I always remember when I was realizing that I was going blind very quickly. And I was standing at the back of the cathedral, so we always went to church. We're just that sort of my wife and I both grew up in that sort of a family, and we enjoy the thing of going to church and the worshiping community. But I was standing at the back of the church holding my youngest in my arms and just realizing that I could no longer see certain things and knowing that the prognosis was very fast. And there was the reading. Consider the lilies of the field, they toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And it just for me, John, says everything's going to be all right. And I was out last night with somebody on a business dinner, and he said, "Why are you always so positive? Why are you always so upbeat?" Now, Will sitting beside me will question whether that's true or not. But I have no doubt that one's belief that there is a bigger world, a bigger presence, a bigger something that none of us quite understand will enable you to cope with as much as you get thrown at. So that would be my piece. So it enables me to come back and have the resilience that you often need. And it is wonderful when you can access into those who can best interpret some of the things that are in the holy books, whether Christian or Muslim or whatever, really. There's great richness there to explore. That would be why, John.
Thank you. That was really interesting to listen to your answer. So thank you very much.
Very good question.
And Jodie Thompson.
Hiya, Jodie.
Hiya. Hi, so I'm Jodie Thompson, Partnership Manager working at Essex Housing. And I just kind of wanted to ask maybe your views or around independent housing for adults, and if there's any more we could do as a county council. We obviously know there's quite a high demand, and sometimes we struggle to meet that need. So it was just looking for your views around that.
Well, there are people here from the system, the wider system. And this, to me, we were talking about it earlier, Will, weren't we? This isn't just a county council issue, it's a whole systems issue. So, of course, I am particularly keen to ensure that we have enough housing units for the people who now grow into old age with learning disabilities. So, they used to be dead by 40, and we're up to 59 now with aspirations to get higher. So there's all the learning disabilities people. And then the people who are recovering from mental illness that we seek to mainstream. There are the people who have other sorts of physical disability. There are all the people growing into much older age, 60% growth in the over 80s going on at the moment, maybe 100% growth in the over 90s and so on. So you need housing for them. But meanwhile, of course, there simply isn't enough housing anyway, which is why we have so many people in temporary accommodation. And in some cases, in Chelmsford, for instance, I think 50% now, there's no space in Chelmsford. And of those, about 10% are ending up out of the county. So I have a particular passion, I would call it, about the right of people with learning disabilities to have somebody call their front door. That's what they most want in life, really. But it's a whole system issue. And I don't think the whole system is responding well enough, quite honestly. Appeals have gone out across the anchor institutions to free up land that's not required. And across the anchor institutions, one organisation, the fire service, responded. Yet we all know that there's big rafts of land held in public hands that could be utilised to do something about all these different areas of accommodation, which need to be, it's not one needs to be favoured over another. You need to understand how you can address a range of needs. I would note, even within the Essex County Council, there is a lot of operational property no longer being used that could be utilised. There needs to be an understanding at district council level. I mean, we famously tell the story of the district council that refused some housing units for learning disabilities on the grounds they didn't have anybody there with learning disabilities. Now, you know, that was some years ago, but it's an apocryphal story that carries on. But it's the sort of thinking that exists, you know. So we need to do far more across these specialist areas. We equally need to do more across the world of housing generally, because we're so short now. And the more we go on, the more it's being squeezed. And I haven't even mentioned the separated migrant children or the care labourers coming out of the system who have nowhere to live. And we are in danger of sentencing them to deeply inferior lives if there is not housing for them. Okay, Jodie?
Thank you. Yeah, and I primarily focus actually on the Greater Essex One Public Estate Partnership, so I totally appreciate and understand that, yeah, there are kind of sometimes land available surplus, but people don't always want to give it up for.
Well, it's not deliberate obfuscation, though. It's a question of where things sit into people's priorities. So they, oh yeah, you get the point, but they don't get around to it. But you know, it is just you need to create a radical, different view of life if you're going to solve this problem. And so it can't be done incrementally. There's really got to be the ability to think in transformational ways and get rid of those barriers in one's mind again.
Thank you.
It's just after 1:45. Are there any other questions? Kate.
Thank you, Will. Slightly abusing my hosting position, but John, you've talked about mistakes and you've reflected about positivity and success, and you've been a very wide-ranging topic. But is there one that got away? What was the thing that you would have liked to have achieved to make a system impact or a community impact that didn't work out as you wished it to? Not a mistake as such, but something that you attempted that didn't ultimately have impact.
I think we will come to understand in 20 years' time the devastating impact of COVID, which will have changed lives and affected outcomes in many different ways. So if you go back to the Church of England, when I became finance chairman, I believed that the whole way in which finance was going into our dioceses was flawed. It was effectively a subsidy, a failure. The formula that hid behind it worked that if you got more people coming to church, you got less subsidy, which didn't seem very wise. So we devised a new system. We went into proactive and intentional investment in specific church ventures in different parts of the country. And until COVID, it was going really well, and we could see positive numbers. But when the churches were largely closed for a big chunk of 2020 into 2021, it rather screwed, and meanwhile the rest of the church finances were so deteriorated, were so adversely affected by COVID, that effectively the money had to go elsewhere. So I'd have loved to have seen where that piece of work that we started in 2015, actually, I took over 13, but it took 18 months to mobilise. So between 15 and 19, progress above expectation. If COVID hadn't happened, where would it have gone? And so that would be the one that got away. I probably feel guilty of things I should have done and didn't. I mean, I bought my first motorbike 10 years after I became blind and had a wonderful 20 years. My last bike was a BMW 1300S, for anybody who knows motorbikes. I always feel guilty that when I was president of Enable, they were doing the climb up Kilimanjaro, and I decided this would be a step too far. I was really frightened of the nighttime state, that if you were perched for 5 nights in tents halfway up the mountain as you progressed, I was really worried that I would just become disorientated and fall off, really, which you might think I was naive. When they got to the top of Kilimanjaro, and I'd already done Snowdon, Ben Nevis and so on for charity, when they got to the top of Kilimanjaro, they phoned me, which was very good of them. And they said, we've made it to the top. Just to let you know, John, there's a blind chap with us who's got no legs. He's got, no, sorry, he's not blind. He's a chap who's got no legs, prosthetic legs, and he's playing the bagpipes. And I did feel to myself, John, you're a wimp.
Well, it's never too late. You could always go again. Kilimanjaro is still there. Thank you, John. So any more questions for John, please, before I wrap up and thank him very much for his time? I think a lot of the people here have asked questions. Will,
Yeah,
any more
that's
hands?
No, not any more hands.
I seem to need to whiz away, John, to prepare for 2 p.m. meetings, perhaps. So you've had a couple of thank yous in the chat, and we'll probably read those to you when we've concluded the meeting. Thank you to everybody who's been here today. Hopefully you've enjoyed another very fascinating Unplugged. We will have this recording uploaded to the YouTube channel for LGE Plus. The next one in October, we haven't quite firmed up the date yet, but it's going to be hopefully an alumnus of LGE who is Ndunge Kavutu, who's gone to the University of Cambridge now. She went to a London Borough when she first left our system, but she's now the head of equality, diversity and inclusion for the University of Cambridge, which involves her in lots of international work, as well as challenging local systems very specifically. So watch this space for adverts for that. We will have the link with you to John's recording hopefully tomorrow. And please be in touch if you have any further ideas about LGE Plus Unplugged speakers you would like to hear from. And yourselves perhaps become one in the long run, as some of our alumni do come back and join us in that way. We are going to be, as I mentioned earlier, promoting recruitment into LGE 2025 during the later autumn, so October and November onwards. So please do watch the space for that as well. And once again, thank you, John, for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Kate.
you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bev, I'll stay on to speak to you in a moment.